We're now going to continue our investigation into how the care and growth model affects the issue of coaching by looking at the actual process of coaching. Now, if one considers coaching as process, then what becomes apparent is that it goes through a cycle. In the first instance, there's a piece to the process which is really concerned with the athlete being on the field playing the game, and we can call that part of the process action. But then there's another piece of the process which is about the coach giving the athlete feedback on the athlete's performance, and we can call that part of the process reflection. And clearly the purpose of the reflection part of the conversation is to set the athlete up to play better the next time he's on the field. Now, if we look at the conversation part of this coaching cycle, it clearly logically would start with a review, which in a sense in spirit is diagnostic. The aim of the review is for the coach to help the athlete identify his learning opportunity. The next job is, in a sense, to set the next task that the athlete is going to do in such a way where the deliverable in doing the task is that the athlete is going to shift his competency, he's going to learn something from doing that job. The athlete then goes on to the field and starts to play the game. But what's very important is that you can't coach a game you're not watching. So the coach monitors what the athlete is doing, and then the athlete completes the game and the next coaching conversation ensues. So if one used the same logic in a work environment, it would imply the following. In the first instance, the leader or the coach has a review conversation with the subordinate regarding the subordinate's learning opportunity. The aim of that review is diagnostic. The coach or the leader then sets the subordinate's next task in such a way that what becomes deliverable in doing the job is not just that the job gets done, but actually a change in the competency of the subordinate. The subordinate then goes and does the job, but as we indicated, you can't coach a game you're not watching. So the boss monitors the job that the subordinate is doing in order to assess whether the subordinate is actually developing the competency required. At the end of the job, you have your next review conversation or your next coaching conversation, which again commences with a review as to whether the subordinate has actually learned what was required or not. This coaching cycle suggests 3 core competencies which a coach or a leader has to have in order to be able to coach properly. Firstly, the coach needs to be able to establish a learning need. Then he needs to observe the game, and then he needs to be capable of having a good coaching conversation. When one's looking at coaching a leader, then some of the core things that are at issue in a leadership role are things like conceptual thinking, strategic thinking, creativity, analytical thinking, adaptability, flexibility, self-confidence, self-control, tenacity, thoroughness, assertiveness, influencing and persuading people, initiative, results orientation, teamwork, managing diversity, listening, custom orientation, managing change, risk-taking, dealing with conflict, coaching others, planning and prioritizing, time management, identifying business opportunities, negotiating, patience, personal disclosure, work-life balance, written communication, meeting deadlines, sensitivity to others, reading the numbers, attention to detail, delegating, and disciplining. So if you're the coach of a leader and you're struggling to find a competency that you'd like to develop in the person, this is normally a good place to start. So what you would do is you'd spend some time watching the person's game. So what you need to do is you need to spend time watching the person's game to identify which one of these competencies would make the most significant contribution to the person's performance. Now, just a final word about identifying a learning need. This is not necessarily always a weakness. In fact, a learning need could be based on a strength the person has that you'd like to develop further. Observing the game is concerned with a coach watching the game with the intent to gain insight into the person's mastery of the current learning requirement and identify new learning opportunities for the person. Now, you can't do that if you aren't actually present in the game. You can't coach a game you're not watching. When you're watching a game, the person's game, it's not just a case of looking at what's happening on the scoreboard or what's happening in the numbers. What you actually have to do is you have to be in the person's area and you have to be clear in your mind what competency would mean for the person's performance. In order to observe, the leader needs to spend time in the subordinates area. The leader cannot coach if he or she never watches the game. Clearly, one can't be both a participant and an observer at the same time. In order to observe, the leader has to stand back from the action. When observing, the leader's role is to provide the eyes that the athlete doesn't have, in other words, the eyes of the other. And observation is about giving attention to the other, absolutely. In other words, it really is about the skill of being able to suspend your own agenda. Further to this, those activities which should be monitored are those which put direct pressure on the subordinate's current learning need. Monitoring is essentially about observation. It is what the coach does while the athlete plays. The best athletes in the world are those who get the closest coaching. And that's very important. Very often people consider coaching only to be at issue with regard to weakness. Now, that's not the case at all. Because you're being coached doesn't mean to say that there's anything wrong with your performance. In fact, probably the opposite. When monitoring, the coach should avoid interfering with a person's game. If the athlete bungles on the field, the coach doesn't run onto the field and do it for the athlete. He listens and observes. In our consulting experience, we've often found this to be a major weakness with people in leadership positions. They find it very difficult not to rush in and do the job for the person, rather than to find out how they can be helpful to the person to set them up to do the job well themselves. Further to this, monitoring needs to be followed by feedback. The coach's observations are only helpful when they are shared. Feedback should, as far as possible, be kept separate from observation. The amount of support given by the coach while the person is performing the task needs to be agreed in advance. The support given should be in line with the person's current ability with respect to the task. The less ability, the more support required. The intention of the coach should always be to withdraw his support as soon as possible. Pilots really only fly when they go solo. Now finally, if we have a look at the actual coaching conversation, then we did indicate that there are two phases to the conversation. There's a diagnostic phase, which we call the review, and there's a remedial phase, which is about setting the task. The diagnostic phase itself has two phases. First of all, one needs to identify the subordinate's learning need. In other words, how is he performing at the moment, and what competency would most enhance his current ability to perform. The next thing is one needs to turn that learning need into a learning goal. In other words, what is the specific competency you're going to try and develop in this instance? Once you've understood what the learning goal is, the next job is to identify the tasks that the person does on a routine basis that actually put pressure on their learning need, so that you can instruct the person in such a way and give them the task in such a way that it becomes absolutely apparent that the deliverable in doing the task is a change in their competency. And then finally, you set the task in view of making the deliverable of doing the task their competency, and you agree on whatever monitoring activity that you will participate in the course of the next reporting cycle.